Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Economic Development Authority meeting. Tonight is Monday, December 9th. Audra, can you have the record show that our city planner is present, along with all city council members, our assistant city administrator, and our city administrator. We'll turn to item 2, which is to consider approval of our minutes from November 12th. Motion would be in order.
And Mayor, I'll make a motion to approve our minutes from last meeting.
Second. Motion by Tina, seconded by Brittany. Is there any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, same sign. Motion passes. Moving on to item 3, bills and communications.
Madam President, Board of Commissioners, there are no bills to be presented for payment this evening.
Okay. Moving on to new business is item 4.1, lease revenue bond series 2024A. Over to
Madam President, thank you. There are materials in your packet. I will review those at a later time here during the meeting, but I'm going to start off with introducing Jessica Green from Northland Securities. She is going to review the bond sale summary, which was distributed to each of you this evening and will be shared here on the screen shortly.
Madam President, Commissioners, good evening.
Good evening.
As Adam mentioned, we held a bond sale this morning at 10 a.m. where we received bids on behalf of the EDA. I'm happy to report that the sale went very well. We received 5 bids for the Series 2024A EDA lease revenue bonds. So we do have a sales summary that is shared up here on the screen. So I'll go over those results and then happy to take any questions that you may have. So we do have a par amount here of $16,900,000. That is due to the fact that we have some premium that was received on the bond. So that's a reduction in overall size from the amount that we discussed last month when we reviewed the finance plan with the commissioners. So moving on to the second page of the sales summary. So of course, the purpose here is to finance the fire and emergency services building. And then of course, we sized the bonds to also include the cost of issuance of the bonds. We have a 20-year structure. Of course, the commissioners discussed those different structuring options when we met last month, and we decided on that 20-year structure. Security here, of course, is the lease arrangement between the EDA and the city. And that lease payment is then made from any available revenues from the city to the EDA. There is no general obligation of the EDA or the city. That being said, it is anticipated that the city will use ad valorem taxes to make that lease payment to the EDA. The results here, again, competitive sale. We did receive 5 bids, with Baird out of Milwaukee being the low bid. We did seek a rating for this issuance, and a AA was assigned to the bonds. That is reflective of basically an affirmation of the city's outstanding rating of AA+, and all of your outstanding bonds, your debt, what that rating was affirmed by S&P. So you do have a rating report that was released and published, and some really nice comments there. The city continues to score very well against S&P's methodology. Some nice comments within that report, but they reflect, of course, the city's well-managed finances, your very robust financial planning, and then, of course, your growing economy. So congratulations on maintaining that rating. You have a final maturity here, February 1 of 2046, and then an optional call of February 1 of 2033. At the bottom of that page, you'll see just a comparison of the finance plan to what we have for final results. So your finance plan had referenced a borrowing amount of $18,420,000. That also included that $2 million reduction in cash, that contribution that the city would make to the project. I do want to note that we did reduce that par amount down to $17,860,000 prior to releasing the OS. That was a reduction due to the final bid amounts being reworked from the time of when the finance plan was produced, and then looking at the various components of the project once all of those bid amounts were compiled. So it was a slight reduction. And then based again on the final amounts or the bids that came in today and with the premium, we are down to $16,900,000. So again, nice amount of premium that came in today. And then really nice interest rate results here. We went from 4.26% down to 3.83%. Now, what that means in terms of the overall city savings, in terms of total principal and interest over the life of the bonds, is a savings of about $828,480 over the total life of the bonds. So again, there is, of course, the option for the city to call in those bonds once you hit that call date out in 2033. But again, really nice savings in terms of overall interest. From there, we'll go on to the bid tab on the following page. So again, you can see Baird out of Milwaukee being that low bid at the true interest cost that came in with the premium of the 3.82. And then KeyBank out of Ohio being the cover bid at 3.83. RBC coming in at 3.84. We show this just to show that those cover bids, those next two bids, very in line with that low bid. And then we've got Messero and Fidelity coming in just a bit higher than that. But again, they really stacked up very nicely, which just means that they were really in line with market. And then from there, you've got your sources and uses. So we've got the par amount of bonds, the 16,900,000. We've got the issuer contribution. So that's that 2 million coming from the city. The reoffering premium at $1 million. Now, the council is familiar with the term premium. You've seen this on the last several bond issues. This is pretty standard in bond issues recently in the last several years. What this means is that investors are looking for a higher stated coupon or interest rate on the bonds. They are willing to give you cash at the time of sale of the bonds to get that higher coupon. So they're basically trading you cash to get that higher rate going forward on the bonds. So effectively, it all comes out in the wash. You're paying higher interest rates, but you're paying less in principal overall. So from there, we then go through the uses of the funds. So you have your deposit to construction fund, that 18,707,000. You've got capitalized interest that will be used to make those first interest payments. You've got your underwriter's discount, your cost of issuance, and then finally, you've got a small amount of rounding that is due to the fact that bonds are issued in the $5,000 denominations. That rounding is paid to the city at closing. Again, just to square that up with those $5,000 denominations. Pricing summary is where we get into where that premium is figured. So you want to pay attention to the fourth column from the very left. So you can see, actually, let's take a look at the third and the fourth columns. So the third column is where you'll see that coupon. That's the stated interest rate of the bonds. So you'll see that those 5s and 4s, that's the interest rate for the bonds, but the yield is what takes into account that cash that was contributed by the investor. So that's the true yield to the city. And that's why we award based on the lowest true interest cost based on those bids that were provided to the city this morning. So again, that lowest true interest cost came out to about 3.83 on a rounded percentage. Again, based on that cash that was contributed to the city, which is why we have a reduction in what that, in the draft resolution that was in your packet, that's significantly higher than what we came away with this morning as a result of the sale, again, because of that premium that was received. So quite a bit lower than what we had been looking at in the finance plan. From there, you've got your debt service schedule, again, significantly lower than what we had been estimating. And then finally, just a couple of graphs for you to kind of take a look at basically short-term interest rates, looking at the last 5 years. And then we also include that longer-term snapshot of going out about 20 years or so. So you can see kind of where rates have gone over the last many years. With that, I am going to ask if there's any questions for me on the sale.
Council, questions?
Madam Mayor,
Go ahead.
I was just curious, you mentioned that it was very competitive. We had 5 bids and it was very competitive. On average, how do you know how many people are going to bid on something like this? Investors.
You
it-
don't know. I can tell you when we looked on, so prior to a sale, underwriters can sign up. So we have a bit of an indication on how many underwriters may bid, but even if they sign up, they may or may not bid. They don't have to, even if they sign up. When we looked on Friday morning, we had 2 bidders. When we looked on Friday afternoon, there were 3. When we looked this morning, there were 5. But even those 5 that signed up, not all 5 of those bidders signed up, but we had about 3 of those that signed up, and then 2 sort of oddballs came into the mix that hadn't signed up. So you don't really know. I will say that Otsego was the only Minnesota sale that was on the calendar today. And there's only 1 other Minnesota sale this week. That's tomorrow. That's Minnesota schools. So you just don't know. I'll say a couple weeks ago, I had a sale where there were 2 bidders signed up on a Friday and 8 bidders showed up on Monday. So it's really the luck of the draw.
Thank you.
But you got some national attention here as you go through that bidding list.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just, you know, the low bid here was out of Wisconsin, but we saw a number of different bidders show up. So some nice national attention.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ryan?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out the premium that you were talking about.
Mhm.
So if I'm understanding that correctly, we paid basically a slightly higher interest rate, but we received that cash from the winning bidder, right?
Correct.
Where does that cash show up? Is it immediately? Is it over time? Is that why the yield is changing?
So you get that at closing. So you
Okay.
have reduced the amount of bonds that you're selling.
Okay.
So instead of, like I said, we had reduced the amount of the sale from that 18,420 that we discussed with the finance plan down to 17,860.
Mhm.
And then due to the premium that was received this morning with the bid that Baird submitted, we are now issuing 16,900,000.
I got you.
So in order to complete the project, the city and the EDA issue 16,900,000. And then you receive also that $1 million from Baird, so that you have that total deposit to construction fund of the 18,707,868.
So essentially the premium reduces the par amount.
Correct.
For the bond. Got
Yep.
it. Okay.
Council, any other questions?
Thank you, Jessica. Madam President, I'm just going to review the materials that were included in your packet. There was a credit rating provided, so the summary report from Standard & Poor's was included in your packet for this meeting. There is a resolution that was drafted by Taft Law that was included in the packet. That resolution is essentially approving 3 things. Those 2 things that follow. There are 2 lease agreements. There's a ground lease agreement and a lease agreement. Both of those are between the city and the Economic Development Authority. And then lastly, there is an indenture of trust with US Bank. So basically US Bank will be serving as the trustee for this bond issue and will handle most, if not all, of the administrative pieces. So receiving the money from the city, paying the debt service on behalf of the EDA, and holding the bond proceeds until the EDA or city would request those to pay for construction costs. So each of those 4 things, the resolution, the 2 lease agreements, and the indenture of trust, were drafted by Taft Law. We do have Martin McGill here, representative from Taft Law, that can answer any questions. And then again, at the end of the RCA, pending approval, the bond would be scheduled to close on December 30th, and there would be proceeds available to start paying for construction costs of the facility. So with that, we'll answer any questions. I'll turn it back over to you, Madam President.
Okay, thank you. All right, council, questions for staff. Otherwise, as Adam said, Maren is present this evening. If you have questions, information from the Taft Law firm.
Madam President,
Yes, Ryan.
I just had a couple quick ones. I don't know what's easiest to reference this, but in Article 2, it's under representations, covenants, and warranties. There's a section that talks about that we are not allowed to permit any entity that is not a governmental unit to use directly or indirectly any portion of the project in a trade or business so as to not impair the tax exempt status of the bond. I believe this has to do with arbitrage. Would you be able to explain that in layman's terms, perhaps?
Absolutely. So of the projects, the facility, let's say the entire facility is 100% of the size. No more than 10% of that facility can be used by any entity that's not a governmental entity without these bonds losing their tax exempt status. So the city, let's say you have this emergency services facility. 10%, if more than 10% of that property is, let's say, like leased to a nonprofit organization, and that nonprofit is making lease payments to the city for their use, that would be an issue. And then the bonds could become taxable in the future, which would cause lots of issues under the indenture. The bondholders could call the bonds, and the EDA would be forced to pay all the bonds at that time. So it's something that you would want to avoid. If any portion of the facility was going to be used by an entity that's not a governmental entity, that's not the city, then we'd want to call us at Taft.
I would assume that doesn't include things like renting out the space or anything like that.
Oh, it would include things like renting out the
Okay.
space.
But
Yeah,
we just have
not
to keep
the,
it
but not to
simple.
the city. The city is an exempt user. The city's a fine user. But if you were going to rent out the space to like any entity that's not the city, then that could be an issue. We do allow for users to like manage the space. So users that aren't a governmental unit, then they could manage the space, but then we have to have like a management contract that meets certain specific provisions in order for that to be okay use. But we want to avoid private use at all costs.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you have another one?
I do, just one quick one.
Sure.
It's just under a heading that says that the tenant is required to pay the project costs in the event of construction fund being insufficient. So I'm kind of curious what happens in the event that, let's say, construction costs go beyond what's in the contingency. What happens in that scenario? I'm assuming that the city has to put up the money in order to pay the EDA to
Mhm.
make sure that the construction costs go through. But how would we appropriate those funds if we're not in a budget cycle? You know what I mean?
Well, I believe that it would come from the taxes, these ad valorem taxes. Was your question if they weren't able to tax for that at the time, or?
Yeah, so if we're towards the end of the project and we're out of contingency, how would we be able to?
You're referring to construction.
Yeah.
You're referring to construction.
Yeah,
If there weren't enough funds. I'm not sure.
Madam President.
Perhaps that's a question that has to do with city finances that I don't know I could answer.
Right, Madam President. So I believe throughout the construction process, the city council has awarded bids for construction. We have a total project cost of just over 18.7 million, which does include contingencies. So the city council would be privy to change orders throughout the project and monitoring that contingency balance. Now, if that contingency balance was consumed with change orders, the city council would need to evaluate internal funding sources, fund balance reserves from different capital projects, possibly internal loans from other funds of the city in order to make up that gap of financing. If the change orders are not imperative that they be approved, the city council may have to decline certain change orders as long as it doesn't affect the construction of the facility, but we would have to look internal either for fund balance reserves or internal loan financing to make up the balance of that.
so I guess a follow-up question, is it the city council that is authorizing the change orders throughout the process?
Madam President, that's correct. So
Okay.
the contracts for construction have been awarded by the city council. They are the contract holder to those construction contracts.
Okay,
Same as like when we do park projects or the water.
I guess one final question. I want to confirm my understanding. There's a lot of documents in front of us, so
Mm-hmm.
I want to make sure I'm following the chain of events here correctly. So the city is leasing the property to the EDA for $1.
Yes.
The
pursuant to the
EDA
ground lease.
What's that?
Pursuant to the ground lease. Yeah.
Right, that's the ground lease part. So
Mhm.
the EDA then is in turn leasing the construction of the fire station back to the city,
Yes, the facility.
the,
Yes.
the facility itself. Okay. And then the EDA is also taking out a bond, essentially a loan to build the station.
Mhm.
And then the city is making lease payments on the station, which the EDA then uses to make payments on the bond.
Yes.
Okay.
So the bonds are issued pursuant to the indenture. And the indenture is entered into between the EDA and a corporate trustee, which in this case is US Bank.
Okay.
And then the EDA receives the bond funds through the indenture, and then those funds are loaned to the city pursuant to the lease. And then the city makes lease payments pursuant to the lease, and then the EDA takes those lease payments and those funds then are transferred to the bondholders through the indenture.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
Anyone have any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You.
You have no more further questions? Sure.
Madam President, if I'd like to make a motion.
Okay.
Motion to adopt resolution 2024-05, providing for the issuance and sale of lease revenue bonds, series 2024A, and the execution and delivery of ground lease agreement, a lease agreement, and an indenture of trust.
Second.
Motion by Jeff, seconded by Tina. Is there any discussion?
Madam President,
Yes, right.
last year, the council was considering how to fund the construction of a city hall campus and was planning on doing so with a capital improvement plan bond. CIP bonds are far more common, less risky, and less expensive for the taxpayer. However, CIP bonds are subject to a reverse referendum, where the citizens can petition to have the project canceled or put on the ballot. It was clear that this was likely to happen if the council had decided to move forward with that project, so the project was canceled. Rather than learning from that experience and involving citizens in these large-scale projects, as other cities do, the council had then decided to do an end run around the citizens. By using this EDA lease revenue bond scheme, it prevents the citizens from petitioning against this multi-million-dollar boondoggle. Because it's not the city increasing the debt, it's the EDA, and citizens cannot petition the EDA. It's an entity of the state and not of the city. This project has no citizen involvement or oversight, and we spent $1 million of taxpayer money to prevent the citizens from having a say. Other cities have their EDA made up of citizens. We used to, but then we replaced it with the Economic Development Authority Advisory Commission. Then we disbanded that. So now the EDA is made up of the council and has no citizen oversight. This episode is proof that the EDA desperately needs citizen oversight. This is a mistake, and this decision tonight shows why. The EDA is being used to avoid citizen petition. On a project where citizen input was not sought, which will increase property taxes by roughly 46%. It's wrong, and I won't be supporting it.
Real quick, you say 46%. Did you do the math on that real quick? I've heard a lot of percentages, and 46% for property tax doesn't sound like 46%.
That is-
3%, I could argue with you. 3, but 45%.
That-
Please explain 45%.
Yes, that is the cost of of the total cost of owning a fire department. That includes the maintenance cost for the fire trucks, the maintenance cost for the equipment, the hiring, the bond payments. In the end, it's going to be a lot of money.
Don't we pay that to Rogers, Albertville, and Elk River? Half of that. So 22.5% doesn't go to those communities.
No, not in the calculation that I'm talking about.
And then when it comes to EDA, you said no citizen oversight. There's 5 citizens on the EDA. Would that be citizen oversight, elected citizen oversight?
I would say that no one elected us to be the EDA, but I will take your point that there are citizens up here.
And we have, for the year and a half, we have argued, I believe, very well on this portion of what our duly elected duty has been sworn to do.
Is there any more comment up here? All right, we have a motion. And a second. Discussion. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, same sign.
Aye.
Motion passes 4-1. All right, moving on to item 4.2, budget. We'll turn this over to our executive director, Adam. And you did have additional handouts.
Yes, Madam President, just bringing those materials up here on the screen. All right, Madam President, Board of Commissioners, item 4.2 is a budget request. So the packet materials include an RCA and a resolution. The resolution was updated after the sale of bonds earlier today and distributed to the commissioners here prior to the meeting. So the two items within the budget are for commissioner compensation being the first. So the Board of Commissioners are to be compensated $25 per meeting. There was an estimated number of meetings at 4 for the 2025 budget, which calculates to a $500 budget request. This item is currently included within the general fund budget of the city within the Economic Development Department. The second is the lease revenue bond for 2024A. Based on the action on item 4.1, the Board of Commissioners should consider adopting a budget. In 2025, there will be recognized debt service expenditures. The amounts here on screen in the RCA have been updated based on that sale. So there's two pieces. There's a fiscal agent fee to the trustee for US Bank in this case, estimated at $2,500. And then there's the interest payment due on August 1st, 2025. That's also been reflected in the resolution. The resolution outlines property taxes in the amount of $500 that is coming from the general fund, as that item is included within that budget respectively. And then bond proceeds in the amount of $442,259. Again, that covers the interest payment and those fiscal agent fees. So the EDA is being requested to consider this budget resolution, which would be adopted by the City Council pending discussion at a meeting later today.
Thank you. Questions for Adam?
Madam President,
Yes.
I'm a little bit confused. How come it went up? If if the bond came in lower than we were expecting, how come it went up?
Madam President, if I may refer that to Jessica Green from ARPA.
So as we discussed, the interest rate on the bonds increased. So those coupons were higher than we anticipated just due to the fact that there's premium. So that is funded though by capitalized interest. So it's just, again, that recognition of that line item for those first interest payments. However, those are paid by the bonds. So within that cost of issuance and your capitalized interest. So you've got a higher amount of capitalized interest within the bond issue. So you're seeing that recognized on a higher amount than what was in the finance plan.
Okay. Thank you.
Madam President, to add to that, the finance plan had indicated an estimated coupon of somewhere in the range of 3.15, I believe, on the initial onset of the debt service payment. Here you're seeing a 5% coupon, which would cause that interest payment to increase. Even though that the principal amount that was borrowed did decrease, that coupon rate changed from 3 something to 5 causes that increase. So.
That helps. Thank you.
All right, other questions for Adam? Other questions? A motion would be in order. You got passed, it was passed out to you. I don't have it. It's the action. Right, yeah. It's just the same.
Same, okay, I just want to make sure.
Ours, Madam President, just should be one motion for a resolution outlined in the RCA.
It's,
Do you see it?
it's the 06, but you gave us a new.
Correct. The number is still 2024-06.
I just didn't get a new one, that's all. That's what I was.
Oh,
questioning.
I apologize. I'm
That's
sorry.
okay, I just want to make sure mine was right, so if I
Yeah.
make the motion, I'll make sure I'm making the right motions. Now, Mayor, I can make a motion.
Okay.
Motion to adopt resolution 2024-06 requesting a budget from the city.
Second.
Motion by Tina, seconded by Jeff. Is there any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, same sign. Motion passes. All right. All right, any other old business?
Madam President, Board, there are no additional items on this evening. So
Anyone else have anything? And a motion to adjourn would be in order.
So moved.
Second.
Motion by Tina, seconded by Jeff. Is there any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, same sign. Motion passes.